New objectivity was an approach to art making that happened in Germany right after the First World War, just at the same time that the nation's first democracy was being founded, known as the Weimar Republic. The artists who were associated with new objectivity, these artists looked at the modern environment with a different style. It was sober, it was unsentimental, it was graphic. It wasn't really a cohesive movement. They did share, however, a skepticism about German society in the years right after the First World War, and a sense of the human isolation that was brought about by widespread social change. So to understand what the German society was dealing with in terms of the aftermath of the war, there's kind of no better way to begin that by looking at Dix's portfolio of the war. We see the battlefield, we see people who have been injured, we see real mutilation. And then we see another aspect of the war, which is what happens to soldiers when they're back in the cities. And you see prostitutes, you see soldiers and prostitutes, you see amputees and prostitutes. If Dix's portfolio of the war is the perfect embodiment of the aftermath of the war, Max Beckmann's Dance in Baden-Baden absolutely epitomizes life in the democracy. It captures a scene of, the top 1% of German society, people who were unaffected or seemingly unaffected by the aftermath of the war. And here they are in a nightclub. You see them in, kind of fancy dress. But interestingly, they're all isolated. There may be couples, but the couples don't seem to interact with each other. There's a kind of loneliness even among these well-dressed people engaged in a kind of a party.
So in this war, we are juxtaposing two very different notions of capitalism. On the one side, we have Otto Dix's To Beauty, which is a self-portrait of, at the time, almost starving artist Otto Dix, where he represents himself as a successful businessman with a telephone receiver in his hand in the inside of a fancy nightclub. And you see a certain fascination with the influences of American culture and capitalism, with a jazz musician in the foreground. On the other hand, George Gross's Construction is a blatant criticism of the influence of capitalism and what it does to the mass of anonymous workers. We see like a maquette of a human being, a faceless maquette in the foreground, surrounded by anonymous industrial buildings in the background, and we see the dehumanization of industrial developments and capitalism of the time. Many artists of the 1920s employed very biting and sharp political criticism to criticize the politicians and the political system of their time. So this monumental painting by George Gross shows Paul von Hindenburg in the center, the president of the Weimar Republic at the time in 1926, surrounded by literally headless bureaucrats governing the German state that is represented by a donkey wearing blinders. And a representative of the rearmament industry is whispering into his ear while the whole scene is uncannily surrounded by images of violence, destruction, and burning cities. The scene is particularly uncanny because Paul von Hindenburg was the president who would later appoint Adolf Hitler as the chancellor 7 years after that.
The second section of our exhibition is the city and the nature of landscape. We see in painting and photography, artists thematize the frictions between the rural and the urban. The rural was seen as a kind of nostalgic kind of connection to the past, and the urban was the future. It was, where things were going. The third section of the exhibition is man and machine. The rapid modernization of industry in the Weimar period expanded mass production, it accelerated urbanization, and it created new relationships between people and technology. We can look at paintings by Carl Grossberg, and we see the factory floor, which began to symbolize both the displacement of man and his advancement. Artists expressed a mixture of a fascination and a skepticism as they looked at the kind of technological progress of the era. The fourth section of the exhibition is still life and commodities. During the Weimar period, these artists tended to focus their still lives on items of everyday life, a dish towel, a broom, a bucket. They focused on newly mechanized appliances. It was a big deal to have a sewing machine or even the electric light bulb. One thing that was really popular during the time, though, were the exotic plants, rubber plants, cacti, succulents. It was something that one found in many homes, and many of the artists chose to focus on that for their subject matter. In a way, some of these works become object portraits. They not only register the mundane details of daily existence, but they show the ways in which new commodities and consumerism in general had begun to insinuate itself into modern German life. The last section of the exhibition is maybe the biggest section, and it's probably the works which people most commonly may associate with new objectivity. These are unflinching portrayals of men, women, children. These works are unsentimental. They defy traditional portraiture. If we think to the ambitious program of photographer August Sander, who attempted to document the people of the 20th century, it reflected a widespread interest in categorization of social order at a time of constant upheaval and change. Otto Dix's portraits are often exaggerated, sometimes focusing on strange or disturbing qualities of the subject. And Christian Schad, by contrast, are more sober, they're more straightforward. Max Beckmann was an artist who depicted himself numerous times in self-portraits. What we see here is a painting from 1927, a kind of iconic work in which Beckmann dresses himself in the costume of the upper class of a tuxedo. He has his hand on his hip, his hand casually holds a cigarette. He's the utter impression of the self-confident artist. So portraiture of this period seems to reflect how traditional notions of gender and sexuality were being challenged in Germany in the Weimar Republic. Many painters and photographers took as their subject the newly emancipated German woman, called the New Woman, a fashionable figure often associated with lesbianism and androgyny. She was often seen with short hair and wore traditional masculine clothing, including suits and wearing a monocle.
The Weimar Republic was a time of unprecedented social freedoms and activism for homosexual rights and new identities in general. So we actually spent some time in archives in Berlin and assembled a selection of the very first homosexual magazines of the time that were actually displayed and sold publicly. So you will see examples of Der Eigene, the Unique, which was the very first gay magazine in history, as well as a selection of different lesbian magazines. And we also included a big photo mural that depicts an image of El Dorado, which was the most famous gay club in the 1920s, to just recreate this atmosphere.
One of the things that the exhibition does is it brings together paintings, works on paper, and photographs. And it, I think, presents them in a way that is pretty convincing in terms of the relationships of these different mediums. And this is really the first time that an exhibition dealing with this new objectivity has brought together paintings with photographs and works on paper.